Hai aperto tutto, tutto visibile anche online? Ok, perfetto. Allora la podio aperto, giusto? Ok, cominciamo, grazie.
We can go. Buon pomeriggio a tutti. Good afternoon. Welcome here to this conference on the Atlantic Alliance, which is the 7th organized by our foundation, addressing the priorities and the decisions to be made before the Washington Summit next year. The international situation is before our eyes, and we don't need explanations. Our central problem is a bloody war taking place in Europe, and the end is not in sight, so the resilience of our societies is called into question. But today, we wish to look at a larger horizon and not to focus just on this issue, which is discussed at length every day on newspaper and on the various kinds of communication. Why doing so? The Atlantic Alliance remains the most important security provider in existence. It wishes to project security outside its borders, and it has been, as it has been several times since a long time. I would like to remind you that it is a political military alliance in this order, and it is a defensive alliance. NATO is now sailing towards its 75th anniversary, proving to be the most resilient alliance in history. And again, this has been said several times, I'm not the first one. While the concept of looking at international security at 360 degrees is more relevant than ever, meaning that security is global and it is necessary to look in all directions, keeping the guard high and the security dialogue alive. On the other hand, ladies and gentlemen, the present situation and the presence of threats, including asymmetric threats, also shows that multilateralism is a guarantee and needs to be used at its best, as we are trying to do. There is another angle to look at it. I mean to have a fresh look at geography. Speaking in Rome, as I'm doing, in this hall, it is impossible not to feel a sense and a concrete attention toward the South. You will not be surprised by this statement. Where we have old partnerships to revive. I'm also thinking, for instance, about the Mediterranean Dialogue, the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. They are 20 years old, and the strategic situation in North Africa and the Middle East calls not for empty words and programs, but for new serious deeds that reinforce the weight and the substance of this relationship. I think this is a very important message I would like to say, a central message. In fact, we see an instability epidemic gaining ground in Africa, and especially in the Sahel, addressing all grievances and imbalances in an underlying priority. But getting new actors that change the way populations are exploited is not helpful. At the same time, again, this is not new, we cannot ignore the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific, where new partnerships are in progress. I would like to name Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. A new chapter that is opening now. We don't know in which direction we will go. And finally, it's in our responsibility to steer a sensible course in troubled waters. In conclusion, history is unfolding rapidly before us, new threats as well as potential opportunities. Therefore, it is necessary to take, to my mind, a decisive action toward the South and to consider options regarding the East. As usual, our foundation aims at presenting an interesting debate. Our methodology is to offer a high international level, in a scientific way, in a spirit of respect, addressing the relevant issues of the day. I'm not going into the details of the program, it is in front of you. I finally wish to thank very warmly the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the venue and for the extended support. The NATO Defense College as a natural elder brother, the generous support of the Compagnia di Paolo, Elettronica, and our traditional media partners for making our press together. I'm very proud to have been able to gather in this hall a high number and a high-level speaker, moderators coming from different walks of life and bringing different angles. And I think it is very difficult to find more competent people than the one sitting at the table today. I wish to thank them very warmly for coming to Rome, as well as those who are making special interventions, Stefano. Finally, and perhaps more important than everything, special thanks to the staff of the Foundation for their enthusiasm and their hard work. And buon pomeriggio a tutti. Grazie per l'ascolto. I would like now to introduce the Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Riccardo Guariglia, an old friend of mine and a great diplomat. Riccardo, to help. Puoi parlare dove? Da qui o da lì dove preferisci.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. You just forget to say that I am also an old friend of NATO, which I think is important today, having worked for 4 years also under your leadership in Brussels. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to host you here today at the Farnesina in order to discuss a current topic of general interest, both for diplomats as well as for scholars, such as balancing priorities after the Vilnius Summit. The title chosen for today's conference, an extremely appropriate choice, has to do with the course the Atlantic Alliance is chartering after the last successful Vilnius Summit, which took place in the midst of the still enduring brutal war of aggression waged by Russia against Ukraine. So let me thank first of all Ambassador Minuto Rizzo, President of the NATO Defense College NDC Foundation, in his function of co-host of this conference, which counts on the support of our ministry, a convinced support, as well as other distinguished colleagues, such as Ambassador Stefano Pontecorvo, with whom we have worked a lot together, and Ambassador Marco Peronacci, a very close friend since many years, and all the other panelists and participants in today's conference. It's a pleasure indeed to meet again so many friendly faces and new ones as well, all brought together by the shared interest in the Atlantic Alliance and in the values implied by participating to such an important organization. Today, more than ever, we need the contribution of think tanks like the NDC Foundation, along with scholars and researchers, in order to consolidate the awareness of the everlasting importance of the Atlantic Alliance vis-à-vis the variety of challenges and threats the Euro-Atlantic community is facing today. It is therefore exactly now, while war has made its return to Europe, that we must confirm our determined resolve to deal with all threats and challenges facing the Euro-Atlantic community, no matter where they stem from, adopting a comprehensive approach. Collective defense remains crucial to provide security over the Allied territory and to its more than 1 billion people. At the same time, a series of hybrid threats spanning from cyber attacks, big data manipulation, disinformation, the possible misuse of disruptive technologies such as artificial intelligence are on the rise and deserve all our attention. Finally, yet importantly, more classic threats, so to speak, and consolidating challenges such as terrorism, illegal migration, very important in this period, arms, drugs, and human trafficking are gaining critical traction, also being favored by the ongoing conflict. As we all know, these factors have led to a growing political and security instability, with mounting pressure on the southern flank of the Euro-Atlantic region. Real challenges indeed come today from Africa. Beside the collective defense, which is and remains the core business of the Atlantic Alliance, NATO thus needs also to reinforce its other two core tasks, that is crisis management development and cooperative security, as Alessandro said, with inter alia a focus on the political dialogue and the practical cooperation with its partners from the Mediterranean and the broader Middle East. Let us not forget that political dialogue and cooperation with new partners, these two core tasks aside collective defense, are closely connected with the founding spirit of our Atlantic Alliance. As President Mattarella said last September, while paying a tribute to the Italian soldiers falling during the Resistenza, an alliance such as NATO is what allows us to defend the values inspiring our societies. And if common values in terms of democracy and multilateral cooperation lay at the foundations of the Atlantic Alliance, it is thanks to initiatives like the one we are attending today here in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that we can contribute to raising awareness on those values. So let me once again thank you all for the efforts undertaken in analyzing NATO's priorities after the Vilnius Summit. I am eager to listen and to learn about your reflection. I say learn because I will be leaving, unfortunately, soon, and inputs concerning the assessment of the current priorities and challenges of the alliance, as well as the projection towards the south of the main output produced by NATO, that is security and stability. Thanks to the speakers gathered around our table and under your guidance, Ambassador Minutorizzo, dear Alessandro, I am confident that new food for thought can be shared, emanating from a think-out-of-the-box approach, which is mostly needed in today's complex historic moment. So I wish you all a successful discussion and warmly thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Florence Galp. She is a person of very high quality that we know very well from her past experience in Rome, and you are very welcome here.
Thank you, Ambassador. And actually, I want to actually bounce back on what you just said about this being my, there's my former boss, hello, of this being my second experience here. There are actually several former bosses here in the room. I left in 2013, and the reason I say this is because when I left NATO Defense College in 2013, it was a different world. We had just been through the Arab Spring. Morsi was still president of Egypt. Actually, no, that was 2012. No, 2013, in the summer, he was toppled. Russia had not yet occupied Crimea. Of course, we hadn't been through a pandemic. It was really different. And now I come back and I find, well, in many ways, some things have not changed, but I find an organization that is actually vitalized and energized by the humongous task ahead of it. So I find NATO is not brain dead at all, because that's where I'm working in. I jokingly say we are part of NATO's brain. And also NATO, at least NATO Defense College, is more ready to take a risk. Otherwise, they wouldn't have hired me. I mapped, so follow me in the research kitchen just for a second, because I thought, what can I tell you that you would perhaps find interesting? And I thought, I'll tell you what we're doing at the moment. So I started this job in May, and the first thing I did was map who else is thinking about the future in NATO. And I discovered that, as I just said, NATO is far from brain dead. In fact, I found that there's different people thinking about different futures everywhere. So there's ACT, there is the Political Security Analysis Unit in SHAPE, there's the Southern Hub, of course, there's a Policy Planning Unit, there's the Office of Net Assessment, and many more. Why is this interesting for you? Because it's important for me that I define very clearly where do we fit into this landscape. Otherwise, we have duplication and redundancy, and we need to, in the time that we are facing right now, this humongous challenge, not just with Ukraine, but with everything else that's going on, we need to truly contribute the best we have. So what I come to conclusion with, or what I think you should expect from us, from the research division in NATO Defense College in the future, is that our future time horizon is 2 to 5 years from now. So we don't do short-term analysis, SHAPE does that. We don't do super long-term analysis, ACT does that. I am tired of NATO relevance. I want NATO actionable, because everything is NATO relevant. As we just heard, NATO has redefined its mission more narrowly, and so do we at the research division. If NATO can't do anything about it, my team is too small to dedicate time to it. We are, of course, strategic level, and most importantly, we have to be terribly original and very unique. Because what has also changed in the last 10 years since I left is not just the world at large, but actually research. The world of research has changed, and how our decision makers absorb information has changed as well. And I think that's something researchers normally don't think about, because I used to be one, I still am one. We are obsessed with problems. We fall in love with problems and love to describe them. We don't really think about the people that we're supposed to serve. How in their busy time do they absorb what we produce? So I will use the NATO Defense College Research Division resources to invest in new kinds of data and new kinds of imagery and everything that we can get actually at the moment, because the magnitude of the problem is too big to not give everything a try. We will particularly work, obviously, on future of war, future of Russia. I'm also interested in China. We will re-narrow, as I just said, what we're working on. And of course, events like this today, events, have you ever wondered why we do events other than having free coffee? We do events to create knowledge and to disseminate knowledge. So events like today are very important and part of our work. So I want to thank, of course, the NATO Foundation, the Farnesina, the Compagnia di San Paolo, who have been long-standing partners of the college, and I hope we can continue to work together as we sail in a very turbulent time. I can assure you, I want you to expect truly astounding things from us. Just give a bit more time, because it takes a while to rewire the machinery. So looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florence. Thank you for your intervention, for your kind remarks. Now, Nicolò Russo Perez, the responsible for international affairs of the Compagnia di San Paolo in Turin.
Thanks a lot, Ambassador. And dear colleagues, esteemed guests, authorities, good afternoon and welcome to all participants. I'm Nicolò Russo Perez. I have the pleasure of representing the Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo in today's event. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer, the NATO Defense College Foundation, the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, and the NATO Defense College. I would like to stress the importance of this cooperation between public and private entities, since it is very timely. With the NATO 2030 process, the organization had an important opportunity to embed contribution from experts from the scientific community and from the private sector, and all were engaged in the challenging task of contributing to the design of the NATO of the future. The Compagnia di San Paolo is today among the largest private foundation in Europe and among the main independent funders in Italy of policy-oriented research in the field of international relations. We are focused on in particular on the three core dimensions of the Italian foreign policy, so the European, the transatlantic, and the Mediterranean. Against this background, the Compagnia is supporting the activities of the NATO Foundation, and this is a long-term strategy with which the Compagnia has chosen to combine the attention to its local dimension, which is the city of Turin, where the foundation was founded back in 1563, with an openness to international issues. And we have done so because we realized that the challenges that we are facing in our daily lives at the local dimension are local declination of much broader global interconnected issues. And the NATO Foundation recently was also selected among the winners of a new call for application launched by our foundation aimed at exploring the still under-researched issues concerning the multiple links between geopolitics and technology, cybersecurity, big data governance, protection of critical infrastructure. And I want to congratulate the NATO Foundation also for this important result. The topic of today's conference is of key importance. The illegal and unprovoked war started by Russia against Ukraine has brought defense issues back to the center of the political agenda. Within NATO, the new strategic concept adopted in 2022 at the Madrid Summit is the result, on the one hand, of the return of large-scale war on the European continent, but on the other also of a process of renewal of the alliance, which looks to 2030 in a context of aggressive multipolarism. The concept gives also priority, of course, to Russia among the various challenges facing the Euro-Atlantic space, while also significantly considering China's growing assertiveness. Of Italian interest is certainly the mention of the southern flank, recognized by NATO as a source of instability and vulnerable to interferences from alliance strategic adversaries. The strategic concept also highlights how the consequences of climate change must be seen as a source of increased fragility in the Sahel, in North Africa, and in the Middle East. Aside of the geographic dimension, with the recognition of the strong interconnection and linkages between eastern and southern flanks, there is also the key recognition of the new nature of many challenges that the NATO countries and their societies are facing. Along traditional challenges, new emerging security challenges are showing potential vulnerabilities in our societies. European states face a full spectrum of threats, including economic and natural resource blackmail, hybrid and terrorist tactics, military intimidation, and wars of aggression. Cybersecurity is a clear example. With its cross-cutting nature, it is critical for maintaining resilience across most, if not all, functions. Cyber attacks on government websites, banks, utilities, energy pipelines, media outlets, and water and sanitation facilities can cripple societies. They can prevent the effective functioning of government and cause widespread confusion, economic harm, and civil disorder. Cyber attacks on energy infrastructure, hospitals, and water services can lead to the loss of life, putting them on par with kinetic means of warfare. In this context, Italy, at the institutional level, but also, and I stress this point, with its private sector, should take advantage of some of the new high-profile NATO initiatives that can advance its industrial interests and, at the same time, the resilience of our society. The launch of the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, DIANA, and the NATO Innovation Fund promise opportunities for Center of Applied Research and startups distributed across the national territory, for example, in Turin, in the field of aerospace, which must be valued. I conclude my remarks by emphasizing how the topic of today's conference is of extreme interest for any public but also private actor. Many thanks to the experts, to all the institutional representatives who accepted the invitation to join us today. Thanks again to the NATO Foundation, all the staff and the leadership of the Foundation, Director Alessandro Politi, Sofia Mastro Stefano, Alice Bugli, and thanks in particular to its President, Ambassador Alessandro Minutorizzo. This is really an event that we at the Compagnia di San Paolo Foundation, a private sector player, we consider of strategic importance to fostering a better understanding of the geopolitical context in which all our societies are embedded. So I wish you all a fruitful conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for your kind words. I now give the floor to Stefano Pontecorvo, the president of Leonardo. You may be surprised that we introduce people coming from industry, but you should not be surprised, because if you look at the evolution of NATO in the last few years, you see that the industrial dimension, the technological dimension, has become much more important than before. So I'm very happy to present my old friend, Stefano. You have the floor.
Thank you, Alessandro. It's great to be here. It's great to be back. Thank you to you for inviting me. Thank you to Riccardo for listening, and to all of you. Oana, actually my old boss in Kabul. So I would like to deliver a few short and quick reflections. We experience the social impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine every day, when we go shopping, when we go buy gas, when we go to the bank, etc. It is not only Kiev that ended up under the bombs, but also our model of relations, already greatly threatened by the pandemic. I believe, therefore, that nothing will ever be the same again, and I deliberately use the formula that began to circulate after 9/11. We must rethink our future, and NATO is central in that. And we have to do it with like-minded geographic areas and through like-minded geographic areas. Globalization, as we had known it, no longer exists. NATO, therefore, is occupying a space beyond that of security to become an economic area and a strong political forum. For 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, the old continent enjoyed peace dividends. In 1989, European countries within NATO still spent about 4% of their GDP on defense. By 2014, the percentage had plummeted to 1.4%. Europe as a whole can afford to spend nearly 50% of its GDP on social spending because there are others who spend on their own security and defense, and on ours too, namely the US. According to a report by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the US has military spending equal to 3.5% of its GDP and covers nearly 40% of global spending. France ranks 6th, Italy 12th. If we see the same ranking for social spending, the ranking reverses. The country that spends the most in relation to GDP is France, in 4th place in Italy, and the United States comes in the 21st place, preceded by all NATO member countries. Today, this is a luxury that is no longer sustainable, at least not on the same terms. Last year alone, Europe spent 320 billion euros on defense, the highest figure since the Cold War. Here, I hasten to add that I'm temporarily the chairman of Leonardo, permanently a citizen of my country. I would much prefer my government to spend on hospitals, schools, and so on, rather than on stuff that we sell. As you can see, security has direct impacts on the social sphere, and therefore economic. I cite an example to explain myself better. As you well know, Italy adheres to the single currency system, and as such, it has to comply with a number of budgetary parameters. It is also a member of NATO, and here too, it should abide by house rules. That is, allocate 2% of GDP to security and defense spending. Like Italy, other European countries also are a part of NATO, but the budget parameters that Europe has given itself do not communicate with those of NATO. At the European level, Italy is fighting for security spending to be taken out of the deficit calculation. The opportunity is right. Next year, the European Commission is expected to discuss with member states the reform of the EU Stability and Growth Pact. I am optimistic by nature, and it seems to me that a profound transformation of unified thinking is taking place at the European level, a transformation that I appreciate. It is moving away, in my view, from dogmatism to make way for pragmatism. Where I come from, they would say, Inshallah. It will undoubtedly be a slow but inevitable process. Forcing it is a process taking place in other countries. China spent in 2022 $292 billion, if you believe Chinese statistics. 4.2% more than 2021, but 63% more than in 2013. Russia, in just 1 year, here again you have to believe Russian statistics. Russia, in just 1 year, the last, increased its military spending by 9.2%. To have a comparison with Europe, in 2022, the continent's military spending increased by 13% over 2021 and touched Cold War levels. But the increase over 2013 was 30%, half of China's. The European security system needs major investments in the near future, either to rebalance the relationship with the United States, or because we do not know where future threats will come from. Certainly not from the US, but they may be threats in which the US is less interested. Security has fast response times, partly because the threats are multi-level, and multi-level responses need to be prepared to those threats. And it would also require a little more foresight and vision on the part of European authorities. All my life I have been a diplomat, and as Alessandro taught me, a good diplomat must always keep an open dialogue with the other side. Identify a shared element of contact, a passe-partout. Today, however, I'm chairman of Leonardo, a company that grew from the seed planted by Cavour in Genoa with Ansaldo. His vision was to make the fledgling Italy participate in the process of industrial transformation that had already begun in France and Great Britain, become steam engines. Today as then, I believe that technology is the element of dialogue with the other side that must be kept alive, the necessary passepartout, a tool that can shorten the distance between the different geopolitical blocs, or at the very least can bring closer and consolidate knowledge, what you were talking about, the previous speaker was talking about, between like-minded blocs. In a special way, I believe that a key role can be played by aerospace technology. It can become, in my opinion, a bridge between countries. In the current phase of uncertainty, we must aim to strengthen the mechanisms for cooperation between countries in science, technology, transfer, and industrial innovation. The aerospace sector, by its very nature, can play a pioneering role in building new partnerships, the bridge I mentioned earlier. First, because it is highly innovative, capital-intensive, and intellectual-intensive sector. As such, it requires investment of resources and engineering know-how that few nations in the world can afford alone. Collaboration is therefore a necessity. The second point that makes aerospace central is its transversality. The strategic nature of aerospace technologies today represents the meeting point on which the interests of states in protecting security and that of companies seeking business opportunities converge. Critical technologies such as artificial intelligence, robotics, cybersecurity, which are increasingly central to our industry, require the building of public-private partnerships. Take the space economy sector, for example. This is a market that, according to a PricewaterhouseCoopers report, could reach the value of 1.5 trillion in the next decade, a huge opportunity. And this is also why, alongside the traditional players, large private players, often from other sectors, Elon Musk, for example, have entered the space race, as have the new industrialized nations. In an increasingly polycentric scenario, we must have the ability and courage to make collaboration on new competencies systemic and strengthen North-South technological cooperation. Obviously, through agreed modalities and dedicated industrial programs capable of protecting the strategic needs of the partners involved. It is important to establish forms of structured dialogue among like-minded partners, as I said before, and international fora such as the G7 and G20. In synergy with each other, can provide the ideal framework for building an inclusive multilateralism capable of fostering technological development and putting it at the service of security and collective growth. The world is rapidly changing, but I believe to be able to keep up with the scientific and technological process, it is necessary to rethink and apply the words of a great Italian of the last century, Donato Manichella. It is in us, it is in all of us. That philosophy enabled Italy to foster the economic boom of the 60s. The international paradigm has changed, but that formula, I believe, is a winning one today. Thank you very much.
I have to congratulate the speaker, not only for the content of what he said, but also for the concise explanation, which is very rare. Thank you very much, Stefano. It's very useful. So now I think we enter into the heart of the conference with the first panel, chaired by Giovanni Lungescu, whom we know since a long time, and the best possible person to start the works of the conference. So I think you can start, Giovanni.
Grazie, many thanks, and buon pomeriggio a tutti. Hello. This panel, the theme of our panel is assessing challenges and priorities, but as we've heard from Florence, from Ambassador Pontecorvo, I think we also need to look at policy options, policy solutions, and action in particular, because this is a different world that we operate in. And just to continue on what Ambassador Pontecorvo was saying, in terms of facts and figures, Russia this year intends to spend 29.4%, almost 30% of its budget on the military. China, as you know, originally set itself the objective of being a world-class military power by 2035. It's now revised that objective and wants to get there by 2029. So I think those figures just explain the world of geostrategic competition that we operate in as NATO, as an alliance that keeps peace and security for 1 billion people in Europe and North America, and preserves our way of life, ultimately, our ability of all of us to live as we choose to live. Now, all the speakers before have outlined the multiple challenges that we face. I would just like to start off this panel by recalling the priorities that were set out in July at the Vilnius Summit. First, bolstering alliance deterrence and defense with the most robust plans since the Cold War. Of course, a strong commitment to defense investment with 2% of GDP as a floor, not a ceiling, so 2% as a minimum. Greater focus on transatlantic defense industrial bases and on innovation. Bringing Ukraine closer to NATO and deepening partnerships around the world, and also starting a reflection on the South and a renewed reflection on countering terrorism. But are we getting the balance between these priorities right? Are we investing on what we need to invest on? Do we actually have our priorities right? And do Europeans and North Americans have a coherent vision of how to go forward? So these are some of the questions that I think we'll have an opportunity to discuss on this panel with a very eminent group of men. Time is pressing. Obviously, the next summit is in 9 months from now in Washington, in July next year, and we have less than 90 minutes to proceed. So without any further ado, I will kick off with our 4 panelists, who will have 7 minutes for their original remarks. Then we'll have a quick first round of questions with 3 minutes for their answers, and then we'll open up to what I hope will be an interactive conversation with you. So please already start preparing your questions so that we can move quickly. Now, Karl-Heinz Kamp is an associate fellow at the German Council of Foreign Relations in Berlin. He's also the former special envoy of the political director of the German Federal Ministry of Defense, a former president of the Federal Academy for Security Policy, and he also helped build up the research division of the NATO Defense College that Florence, whose future is in Florence's hands. Karl-Heinz, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Oana, and thanks for having a former here on the panel. I think in the meantime it's a no-brainer, and we heard this a couple of times, that Russia's attack on Ukraine changed everything in security policy, and that's why I would like to raise 2 simple questions. First, what are the challenges now, and what changed so much by the war in Ukraine? And second, very simple, what are the consequences for NATO's priorities and for burden sharing within the alliance? And it's always with the disclaimer that we don't know yet when this war will end and how, which can change once again everything. So let me start with the changes imposed by the war and by the future challenges, and 5 quick points. First, Russia. Regardless how this war ends, Russia will face an unprecedented decline, economically, politically, and militarily. And this can mean either a more aggressive Russian government, it can mean a significant weakening of Russia, of Russian military strength, by burning all its modern weapon capacities without the possibility of military reconstitution. It can mean decolonialization or disintegration of Russia with unpredictable consequences, and each of these scenarios will pose different necessities and reactions for NATO. Second point, China. Independent from the developments in Russia, China will even more strive for economic strength and military power, just to take its self-perceived role as the future leading power in the world. And this means there will be no cooperative China for the years to come, but a rivaling power with a quick military build-up and a quick economic build-up, military build-up particularly in the naval and in the nuclear area. Third area of change, MENA, Middle East, Northern Africa. Instability in this region will remain. Probably it will even increase. In many MENA countries, we have very young societies looking for jobs, something the economies there cannot provide. We have shrinking energy exports, which reduce further the state budgets, and not to forget the global south is suffering most from global warming, and this is likely to increase the crisis there. And this means crises in that region will particularly affect Europe through migration, for instance, or terrorism. Fourth point where things change significantly, European Union and common European defense policy. The EU has proven to be very united, very efficient in implementing the sanctions on Russia, supporting Ukraine, the energy policy, dealing with Ukrainian refugees. Hence, the EU became a key security policy player, but not a military player. This has been left to NATO. And this means that this idea of the European Defense Union, this autonomous or sovereign body able to do its own military issues, it was not very realistic at the first place, and now it's fairly dead. It is dead simply because the Eastern Europeans don't want this anymore. They asked, where would we have been in this war without the Americans, without the US? And this means that the future lies not in an independent EU, but in the close cooperation between EU and NATO. Fifth area of change, transatlantic relations. The good news is that the West, this idea of freedom, democracy, and market economy is not dead, but very much alive. And this is probably the biggest surprise for Xi Jinping and Putin. Still, the current transatlantic cohesion cannot be taken for granted, simply because the US is a deeply divided country, which makes it fairly unpredictable, and we saw this in the recent days. And because of 4 years of Trump, plus the pictures of the mob vandalizing on Capitol Hill, the US has lost much of its moral character as the beacon of democracy. And this means Trump or one of his clones might come back and pose significant challenges for the transatlantic relationship. What does all this mean for NATO's priorities? 4 quick points. First, Russia. Russia is likely to pose a threat for NATO in the years to come. At the same time, Russia is unlikely to be at the forefront of emerging and disruptive technology simply because it is cut off from modern technology to a great deal by the sanctions. This means dealing with Russia requires the classical deterrence and defense at NATO's eastern borders, including permanent stationed forces there. It also requires, and just has been mentioned with the question of Ukrainian NATO membership. Yes, we can discuss this. There are many reasons in favor of this. However, we have to keep in mind that this would mean that NATO has to defend Ukrainian security at its eastern borders. And the eastern border, and by the way, Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe after Russia. And this means the eastern border of Ukraine is 1,300 kilometers away from the Polish border. And to do this for NATO would be a true challenge. Second point, the Asia-Pacific. NATO will, for the next years, be internally confronted with 2 different views on the Asia-Pacific. The United States has made it already as its top priority, requesting the support of NATO. And the US argument is, you Europeans will also be affected in your vital interests if anything goes wrong in the Asia-Pacific region. So you have to do something. At the same time, most of the Europeans say, yes, this might be true, but NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization and not for Pacific Defense Organization. Still, despite this, we have this dispute, NATO cannot ignore this change and the Europeans cannot ignore this change, and this means that we, the Europeans, have to take more burden sharing in our extended neighborhood to free US forces to operate in the Asia Pacific. And this requires, of course, on the European side, greater maritime capabilities. And also NATO can, and it does already, support partnerships with countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, or New Zealand. Third point, MENA. Between these two top priorities of NATO now, Russia and the Asia Pacific in future, MENA is likely to fall behind, simply because of two reasons. First, many challenges in the Middle Eastern region, in the region south of the Mediterranean Sea, are more socio-economic and less military, which means terrorism, migration, instability are not necessarily military issues. And the second reason is why it might fall behind is that we have an intervention fatigue in all NATO countries on crisis operations, particularly after Afghanistan, particularly after Libya, Iraq, and now Mali. And this means that NATO is not ideally suited for these challenges in this region, and it can offer mostly supportive elements like surveillance or maritime patrol. This is very much, to a large degree, a task of the EU. And the fourth and last point, transatlantic relations. Another isolationist president in the White House cannot be excluded. Hence, it is the absolute priority also for NATO to make the transatlantic relationship Trump-proof. And Trump-proof means to rebut one of the key arguments Trump had and in which he was right, by saying we, the US, are still subsidizing European security, and this is no longer acceptable. And this is unfortunately true. He was right. And this means, yes, progress has been made on the European side. We just heard the figures. But still, even the new defense investment pledge might not be enough with all the challenges we have. Germany, my own country, is able to support the 2% only for the next 5 years with this extra 100 billions, which we got. Some countries don't even try to come close to 2%, which means that the key necessity is still that the Europeans put their money where their mouth is. Thank you very much.
Okay. Just want to remind everybody that around the table of the North Atlantic Council in Brussels at NATO HQ, ambassadors have 3 minutes. So we're being super generous around here. Thank you very much, Karl-Heinz. But we'll try to stick to the time, and you don't need to applaud after every intervention. You know, let's have this as a conversation. I know. Though, of course, Karl-Heinz really deserved it. Camille, to my left, Camille Grand is a distinguished policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations in Brussels, after an equally distinguished stint as NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment. And he also held very senior positions both in the French Ministry of Defense and the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, among many, many other distinguished things that he did. Camille, over to you for 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Coming from a distinguished fellow at RUSI, I'm honored. No, it's really great to be here and to see so many old friends and be back in Rome to discuss NATO affairs as we often do, thanks to the NATO Defense College. My task in this panel is to look at our efforts to restore conventional deterrence. And obviously, and that has been described at length by my predecessors, so I don't need to expand on that, there is the new security environment imposes to really review the requirements of deterrence and defense in an unprecedented way since the end of the Cold War. Let me just maybe start with 3 preliminary remarks before diving into conventional deterrence per se. First of all, it's not happening in a vacuum. Conventional deterrence is taking place in a context where we do have nuclear deterrence. NATO is and remains a nuclear alliance. And nuclear deterrence does need to work hand in glove with conventional deterrence and in what we call the appropriate mix of nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capabilities. But the truth is that the massive adaptation that I'm about to describe when it comes to conventional deterrence is not happening in the nuclear domain because the Allies have not decided that we were at a stage where a fundamental review of the nuclear posture was necessary, even though there are some significant adaptation in terms of readiness, but that is not the focus of the moment. Second, the adaptation I'm about to describe did not start in February 22. I think it's, in all fairness, many of us around the table were in the building before. This whole process really started in 2014 at the Vilnius Summit with the Defense Investment Pledge and with a number of decisions taken summit after summit since 2014, including enhanced forward presence on the eastern flank of the alliance as early as 2016, and a number of points about readiness and resuming large-scale live exercise, all sorts of things that preceded the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22. Of course, the Russian war on Ukraine has given not only more visibility, but a significant boost to all of this. And for those who had any doubt about the value of this adaptation, it became absolutely crystal clear that we needed to do it and probably do it faster and somewhat bigger. Third preliminary point, this is a long-term endeavor. This is not something that happens overnight, and that can be, this sort of transformation is not I wouldn't say a generational endeavor, but certainly is about thinking in mid to long term, 5 to 10 years effort to reach the point that are needed. So how is this strengthening of conventional deterrence happening? Obviously, and Karl-Heinz just mentioned that this is about spending more to restore the armed forces and prepare for the future. The reality, and we can be, I think, bluntly honest on this, is that we've seen the consequences of more than a decade of declining defense spending with and of those deep cuts, with reduced combat readiness and forces that in some instances had become quite hollow, to be blunt. And that in a degraded security environment does put at risk our defense and deterrence posture, and requires this effort. I mean, it's just as simple as that. Probably had we spent more or less 2% since the end of the Cold War, we would not need to do this big effort today. And I think it's probably one of the lessons I would learn from this, that thinking in terms of good and bad times always is important. Second, it is indeed about building back and better, to misquote a presidential motto in the US. It is about ammunition and spare parts, doing boring things. I always, when I was Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment, I always said the no defense minister would put on a T-shirt, "I bought ammunition and spare parts." This is precisely what they're doing now. They prefer to launch the last satellite or buy the new airframe, but this is very, very important. It is also indeed about rebuilding the right numbers of major platforms, of key enablers. Those things, again, require time, and there is an issue of finding the right balance between, let's say, legacy equipment and technology and investing into the future so that NATO can remain this sort of most technologically advanced and successful military alliance that preserves peace in Europe. Third, and this is a bit the untold story, this is a lot about strengthening readiness, doing much more training, exercising, planning. Again, these things are not the most visible, but they are sometimes the most critical. So restoring the sort of muscle memory of NATO by having live exercise, large-scale live exercise. This started about 5 years ago, I would say. It has now become a common feature. It is extremely important to sort of test the readiness so that also it's deterrence in action. And mark my words, the potential opponents are watching those very carefully, and they know exactly how good we are or we are not from that perspective. And that involves a form of day zero readiness, which is also very demanding for our militaries. Fourthly, this is about revising the defense posture and the defense plans. That has been the core focus of SACEUR over the last couple of years. Probably the one that is visible in terms of physical footprint. There's one visible part which is a physical footprint, especially on the eastern flank of the alliance, but this is also about doing the right planning there. So first, expanding the presence on the eastern flank. When in 2016 we decided collectively as NATO to have a so-called enhanced forward presence, that was the first time that there were permanent stationing of troops on the eastern flank on the territories of the new allies. That was at the time seen as a major step, a response to the illegal annexation of Crimea and the new Russian behavior. This is dramatically changing now. Not so much in numbers, even though the numbers of battle group has doubled, that presence has become somewhat heavier, slightly larger numbers, but it is more importantly a presence that is more combat ready. In a way, what I would argue is that in the early stages of that presence, it was very much about how much is too much, and now it's how much is enough. And there is a sort of a permanent conversation on this. The land domain is the one that is the most visible, but obviously there is an interest also in seeing what's happening in the sea and air domains, with air policing being much more visible in the Baltic Sea in particular, and with a presence at sea that is there. The novelty also is that these forces are now placed under SACEUR's direct command in peacetime, which is something that is unprecedented since the Cold War for operations inside NATO's territory. I think that this combines sort of sends a clear message, guarantees solidarity, demonstrates unity, and is very important in terms of conventional deterrence by making absolutely clear that we are getting there. And it does work. We've seen that the war in Ukraine has not touched down. There's the whole planning story, and this is really important to do theater-wide planning, to do logistics enablement, to do training, and also to think about new domains of operation, space and cyberspace, and also undersea infrastructure. Let me close by flagging one last point. I think it is important, as I've just outlined, the sort of very massive transformation of what NATO is doing, to stress that NATO is not engaged into an arms race or some sort of mirroring of the Russian policy. The posture remains very defensive. The numbers speak for themselves. We're talking about 40,000 people, nothing that would enable to invade even Belarus. Very restrained in the way it's operated, which makes it quite sustainable, and it's important as well there. And it does recognize that Russia is not the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact, but it does pose a risk. So in conclusion, this effort was necessary. It is a long-term endeavor. It's not over. It will require sustained effort, and I would argue, as the point made by a number of predecessors, that this peace comes with a modest price tag, but that is the whole intent of this evolution of the conventional posture of the alliance. Thank you very much.
Press again. Try the other bit. Super. Okay. Now we'll move over to a view from across the Atlantic with Eric Terzwolo, who's professorial lecturer at the School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C., who's not just a teacher, but also a practitioner, having served at the U.S. State Department for many years, including here in Rome as Minister Counselor for Political Affairs at the U.S. Embassy. Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Anna, for the kind introduction, and I want to thank the NATO Defense College in particular, as well as the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where I spent many happy and fruitful hours in my former life, and everyone who's helping make this noteworthy event possible. I was asked to, in fact, talk about the transatlantic bond at this point in time. So I would say while the alliance has its problems, I think all of us could list some of those problems pretty easily. I'd argue that on the whole, and at this point in time, the transatlantic bond is very solid. In recent years, we've revamped our perceptions of threats, notably from Russia and China. We're seeing better thinking on how, on the military dimensions of dealing with those threats through, for example, the deterrence and defense concept. Equipment and material requirements, and how to accelerate cooperative work on new and innovative technologies are getting a lot of attention. So we are doing a lot together. Of course, all of this takes money. It's the 2014 Wales Summit of NATO, as already mentioned, after Russia's seizure of the Crimea, enshrined politically, though not in a legally binding way, of course, the 2% target of GDP target for defense spending, as well as the target of 20% of defense spending dedicated to equipment. From a transatlantic perspective, this was a significant step in an issue with a long and not always happy history. I personally can remember in the 1980s, for example, some vigorous discussions in Washington, and I'm using diplomatic language there, regarding what we term burden sharing or allied contributions to the common defense, and the adequacy of those contributions. And this was at a time when we were already reminded that by Ambassador Pontecorvo, I think, that defense spending was higher in percentage terms than it is now on both sides of the Atlantic. Before leaving for the Vilnius Summit, the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told the New York Times that 2% should not be seen as a ceiling to hit, but really a floor that should be built upon. And the Vilnius Summit language, again, as I think we've already discussed here, operated very much in that sense, enduring commitment to the 2% target, as well as an important affirmation that it was likely necessary at some points to go beyond the 2%, and the 20% of defense budgets spent on equipment commitment. Now, it is fair to ask ourselves whether the 2% target is in fact a good target, whether it's an optimal target, okay? It's certainly come in for plenty of criticism, and arguably the one-size-fits-all approach does not take into account the specificities of the individual member states, their needs, their limitations, and so forth. But I want to come to a defense of the 2% target and the 20% target as well. In the US, we often say, if it ain't broke, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. And I think that's very applicable in this case. For one thing, even if it is just a floor of sorts, it is a commitment agreed to among all the allies and that applies equally to all alliance members. I think it's politically useful to have very visible reminders of the basic equality of the allies, the equal sharing of burdens and responsibilities. I mean, we do have that reminder in the consensus requirement, but that often gets spun in, to my mind, a somewhat negative way as giving every member state a veto. I think there's a more positive way to see it, but perhaps that's a topic for another day. I also think that 2% and 20% specifically are good targets. They're both realistically reachable and something of a stretch for some countries. I think that the combination of those factors does make them good targets. Two quick observations based on the 2014 to 2023 defense expenditure data that NATO published last July. One, in 2014, only the US, UK, and Greece were at meeting the 2% guideline, according to this NATO data. Estonia was very close. So let's say four allied countries were meeting the target. By this year, we're up to 11 countries, including new member Finland, and a considerable number of the member states are in fact closing in on the 2% target, or started getting quite close. Second point, and I think very very interestingly, as of this year, all the member countries are spending at least 20% on equipment. In 2014, there were only 6 countries that were at that level. An interesting group, by the way: US, UK, France, also Turkey, Estonia, and Luxembourg. Of course, Russia's barbarous, frankly barbarous invasion of Ukraine has provided a special stimulus to spending on capabilities for sustained high-intensity warfare. But I think the data also suggests that, broadly speaking, we've been realistic in setting our objectives. To cite Jake Sullivan again, incomplete is the grade, but the direction of travel is positive. I would translate that as, we are not yet where we need to be, but we are getting there, essentially. I think that having a shared goal that is reachable and where progress is visible is extremely important from a political perspective. NATO is an alliance of states with no supranational authority vested in the institution. That's one of the secrets to its persistence and success, in my view. That said, it also means there are 31 separate national defense budgets that provide the assets and resources for the common defense. The decisions on those budgets are national decisions, and they're intensely political. The West is frankly in a difficult political passage. My own country has, at this point in time, an administration that is intensely Atlanticist and public opinion that is roughly 2/3 to 3/4 supportive of NATO. But we know from experience that things can change. The ideal of shared responsibility for world order has powerful opponents in the United States, with a mix of conservative isolationism, populist and sovereignist impulses. In the current US political debate, America's transatlanticists, including myself, have to be able to illustrate that our allies and partners are doing their part, and that the alliance as a whole is visibly setting and meeting security goals. Thank you.
Okay, super. Thank you very much, Eric. Now for our final panelist, last but not least, Roberto Menotti, Editor-in-Chief of S.p.A Online, Senior Advisor for International Activities of the Aspen Institute Italia, who of course has worked with the research arm of the Italian Ministry of Defense and was also a NATO Fellow with a research project on NATO's Mediterranean Dialogue Initiative. He's also, as the Italians here will know, an op-ed commentator for Italian media. Over to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers and the many friends and colleagues who I can see here today. I would start from a very quick observation that can frame my remarks, that I believe we should probably use a continuum when it comes to what NATO should and can realistically do to face all the challenges that have been mentioned, which is functions, from which we can derive specific missions, from which we can derive capabilities, which will determine investments needed, let's say the resource allocation. That's probably a simplistic, let's say, sequence, but I think it helps frame the conversation. And I would then add that the general approach that recent NATO document in general are adopting is that NATO keeps having a regional mandate, but of course is inevitably adapting a global mindset. Now, this combination is very tricky, and I think a lot of what has been said on this panel reflects this dilemma, that we need to do both. There's no way out of the dilemma. It's been mentioned about China, it's been mentioned about Russia versus the Mediterranean. As an Italian, I'm especially, of course, involved in that very old conversation, you know, eastern flank, southern flank, and so on. Now, coming to the capabilities issue, I have a couple of criticism on, about the way in which we have discussed these things over the past few years, not in NATO, but much in a broader sense, let's say in the intellectual community, security community, including within NATO. And one is that sometimes it seems to me we have been chasing specific capabilities that we needed on the occasion of one specific mission. So we basically fell in the classical trap of trying to re-fight the latest war. It's probably, understandable temptation, but I think it's a mistake. So chasing the latest experience is usually a mistake. Of course, it's very hard to envisage the next challenge. It's much easier said than done, but it doesn't make sense to try and go back to the previous experience. So that's one general, let's say, criticism I have, so something we should be warned about. We should play to our strengths, which means in some cases we can adapt very quickly, we can use new and old technologies in ways that are even surprising sometimes, and that's a good thing. So we don't need to be too specific in sort of using a crystal ball to imagine what the next big thing will be. We need to use a wide menu and then, hope and adjust. I think that's a realistic way of addressing some of these questions. The other warning, let's say, I have for the next future is, I think we've become obsessed in recent years with hybrid warfare. And of course, we now know that it's been a strange obsession if we think about it, because Russia was crucial in this whole debate. The same country that has bombed, factories and schools and cities and infrastructure in Ukraine, but we should have known because they did the same in Syria, for example. So it shouldn't have come as a big surprise. So much for liminal warfare, and all that very interesting literature that I think we should probably reread and reassess. Now, it doesn't mean that hybrid warfare is unimportant, but I think it should not be the focus of our efforts. And I think we're going in the right direction in this sense, as we've been reminded. Now, one again broad point on investments and how to assess what we're trying to do. I'm always a bit worried about the fact that in places like this and meetings like this, we often forget about public opinion and the fact that we badly need to convince the wider public that these, the amounts of money we're talking about are well spent. And I think the public is not convinced. I think a majority of Italians, Europeans, perhaps even more generally NATO citizens of the NATO members are not really persuaded that we are actually spending the money in the best way. It's a constant fight. It needs a lot of patience, and it's almost like a popular science type of effort. It's public diplomacy. It's an effort to explain, but to continue to make the point. I think that's absolutely indispensable, because otherwise, once you get to the point where you have the difficult choices to be made, like right now, for example, my government in this country, with the balance sheets in your hands, well, that's where the problems begin and end sometimes, because there's no sufficient support, or you fear you don't have enough public support. And at that point, policymakers are not enough, because the politicians will not take the risk. So it's an indispensable step. And I understand NATO is doing a lot about this, but the more, the better. Last point on the burden sharing, which, yes, I agree with everything that's been said. It's an old and tiresome debate, and often our American friends have been right in this perspective. I would add just one point. When I think about the Indo-Pacific addition to the list of NATO, let's say, functions rather than missions in a general sense, I think we as Europeans, and here I'm thinking of all the Europeans, but especially the major European countries, should resist the temptation to refocus their effort on the Indo-Pacific. I think we should really do much more in and around Europe. So I very much agree with the idea that we should sort of compensate and be complementary with what the United States will be doing over the next few years. Of course, this doesn't mean we shouldn't be participating, supporting, helping, training, with the United States and with the other members of the network in Asia, which is a perfectly good idea. But we should really do more about the I would say, let's say to use a geographical metaphor, the straits that are much closer to home rather than the Taiwan Strait or the Malacca Strait and so on. I think we should really look, for example, at what's happened recently in places like Libya and of course Syria and so on and so forth, and what's happening in Sahel. Again, we should probably be ready to walk and chew gum. So the Indo-Pacific will be increasingly important, but I think it cannot realistically be the priority of the European NATO members. It will be a huge waste of resources. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
If you try to press it again, super, thank you. Okay, thank you very much to our panelists. I was just checking actually, Roberto, the latest NATO polling that we did just before the summit in Vilnius, including on public opinion on defense spending, and actually across the alliance, the figure is 73% in favor of maintaining or increasing defense spending. In Italy, it's true, it's on the lower end with 22% in favor of increasing and 38% in favor of maintaining. But clearly, this is a debate that frames a lot of what we do and actually is a key debate as we go forward, and hopefully this is also part of that debate. So, and I will actually kick off with the issue of defense spending and turn to Karl-Heinz. I was listening very carefully, Karl-Heinz, and you only mentioned one word once, and that was Germany. And of course, what Germany does is absolutely key for what European allies do in terms of defense spending as the largest economy in Europe. So you seemed very skeptical about the Zeitenwende, the announcement by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to spend an extra 100 billion euro on defense. How can other allies actually push Germany into the right direction of maintaining that commitment and therefore keep the whole discussion on burden sharing honest? Because without German contribution, I think it's quite hard to discuss, to talk about fair burden sharing.
Well, I'm not skeptical at all. On the contrary, I'm excited. I'm excited by what happened in Germany. I didn't expect this, because we had, for years and years, we had speeches of top politicians in Germany saying that Germany will take a bigger responsibility and so on. The Zeitenwende speech of Chancellor Scholz of the 27th of February had one difference, namely 100 billion, putting 100 billion on the table. And this is the heck of a lot of money. And we can discuss whether the inflation cuts and whether we are quick enough in spending, but I think that the UK or the French forces would be happy if they would get 100 billion. The concern I have is, or it's not a concern, I think it's not fully answered the question, what happens if the 100 billion are spent? And here I'm not sure whether the Germans are really aware of what the government agreed upon. Then because we're always discussing, well, 2% maybe we reach it and so on, the law that codified the 100 billion says explicitly, and all the German parliamentarians signed this, I'm not sure whether they all read what they signed. It says that if the 100 billion are spent, are consumed, are used up, Germany will provide a defense budget, I quote, sufficient to fulfill NATO's planning goals. This will be significantly more than 2%. I have no idea how any government in 3 or 4 years, when we have to pay back the interest for all the EU money we were spending, of the COVID money we were spending, of the climate measures we are now taking, how any government, regardless which one, will be able to provide a defense budget sufficient to fulfill NATO's planning goals. So this will be, so basically the proof of the pudding lies in the eating, and the eating now for the next 3 or 4 years are granted. Very good. I didn't expect this. But what happens after this? Thank you.
So Camille, you were talking about hollow forces, despite this effort that's been made in NATO, actually not since 2024, as you said, indeed, but since 2014, so for the whole decade. But with the sort of challenges that Karl-Heinz has outlined, has Vilnius done enough to make those hollow forces readier and more robust in the time frame that we need them to be?
I think that, I mean, the message coming from Vilnius is very clear, and it was important to talk about a floor, not a ceiling. It was important that a commitment to 2% was renewed when a number of allies were sort of maybe not hoping, but thinking that, you know, that was made 10 years ago, so we're going to take stock of where we are, and so on and so forth. Now we are in a different situation. Focusing on the nature of the forces, I think we're not there yet, let's be honest, for a number of allies. Not all of them, but for a number of allies. And for that, the combination is a bit twofold. One is to restore some mass in a number of domains. I'll take an example, which is a country that is generally serious on defense, but and has a long history of being serious on defense, which was the Netherlands. The Netherlands in the Cold War days was capable of deploying a corps in Germany to the front line. Now there is a debate on whether the Netherlands is capable of deploying an armored brigade altogether, which is a massive reduction. So nobody's asking to reinstall military service or conscription or whatever, but I think there is a gap there that needs to be filled and we're talking about a relatively large, medium-sized ally, which is wealthy and so on and so forth. So that is an issue. Second, we need to, I think there is a very big effort to do on readiness and training, so that precisely the allies put their acts behind their words. So one thing is to say we are committed to this. The second thing is to make it happen and to test that. And the interesting thing is that SACEUR will be testing this more and more. Thirdly, I think the key issue, and there I'm with Karl-Heinz on when it comes to Germany and many others, is the sustainability of the effort. You know, the whole point is, you know, the stop and go. We spend a lot for a few years, and there I think there needs to be an effort through the NATO defense planning process to make sure that all allies do the right thing over time, and not, you know, just sign big checks right now and are no longer able to sustain this effort to maintain the forces that or the equipment they will eventually acquire, and that requires again something that is an effort that will not vanish over time.
Yeah, and indeed, defense spending is probably the key element to make the alliance, as Karl-Heinz put it, Trump-proof, which is basically reassure the United States that European allies and Canada are pulling their weight. I suppose one good piece of news that we have is that this year, European allies and Canada will have an increase of 8.3%, which is the biggest increase in defense spending for many, many, many years, and this is the 9th successive year of increase in defense spending. But of course the question is, how sustainable is that? So how concerned are you, Eric? You sounded very confident at the beginning of what you said, but how concerned are you when you look also at what seems to be somewhat fraying support for Ukraine, that might translate once again in the US election campaign into fraying support for NATO?
Thank you, Joanna. That's a great observation. And in fact, I am concerned. Okay, I painted with a broad brush and maybe was giving the glass half full view of things. I think there is a lot to be concerned about. With respect to aid to Ukraine specifically, I think the debate in the U.S. is rather complicated in the sense that there is actually a good debate, a debate of high quality going on, but it's essentially among people who are supporters of aid to Ukraine. Basically, we argue about, is it enough? We're aware of what other countries are doing. You know, it's a well-informed debate, and it's largely, should we be doing more? Should we be doing differently? The problem is when you sort of translate that into the broader political debate in the U.S., let's say, between the friends and opponents of aid to Ukraine, it gets to be very different, because fundamentally the opponents of Ukraine aid really aren't interested in Ukraine at all. That's not what they're actually talking about. They are essentially trying to score points with, their political base, which has no great understanding of the issue. It's the buttons they press are things like, well, essentially anything we do for Ukraine is bad because it takes money away from things we want to do in the U.S. You know, it threatens our southern border. We can't possibly do southern border and aid Ukraine at the same time, which of course we can do. It's a matter of political will and thinking it through. So there's almost not a common ground for a debate between the opponents and supporters of Ukraine aid. We're talking past each other, regrettably. And you see this it's come out very clearly in recent days when you have essentially our aid to Ukraine gets removed from a temporary budget that we absolutely had to pass. I mean, the U.S., the House and Senate did the right thing, and the President did the right thing in signing that bill, but it leaves us at a big impasse with respect to aid to Ukraine. And it's a clear example of a U.S. system that was designed to, in some ways, avoid the tyranny of the majority, but actually allows space sometimes for the tyranny of the minority. That minority in this case, this is anti-Ukraine, or at least anti-aid to Ukraine. So tough issue. I'm not sure how well we'll do in solving it.
Okay, and I'll just ask all the speakers to speak perhaps closer to the microphone, just to make sure that everybody can hear what you say. And I'll just turn to Roberto now. Roberto, you very rightly said that, of course, NATO is a regional alliance. It's an alliance of Europe and North America. It does not aspire to be anything else, like a global policeman or anything like that, but it does face global challenges, so it needs to look to partners, to like-minded partners, a bit like what Ambassador Stefano Pontecorvo was saying earlier. But you also said NATO should do more in and around Europe than in Indo-Pacific. Do more what? Give us 3 examples of what NATO should and could do more of.
Well, I think one element of this, as I was speaking, I was thinking, for example, of the fact that doing Ukraine right is already doing more. Because Ukraine, and that's part of what I was saying about public opinion as well, to be able to explain, to make the case, to make the argument for what we're already doing, because we'll probably need to do much more on Ukraine, even once the war is over, because Ukraine will have to have guarantees one way or the other, and will have to be rebuilt, essentially, and then reintegrated, or much more than before. So doing Ukraine right, I think, is one issue, with the addition that I would say Ukraine has a systemic meaning, because what we do in Ukraine is also a message to China, inevitably, and I think they're listening, they're watching very, very carefully, not only from a military perspective, but in a sense of resilience, seriousness, stamina, and adaptability. So not just the immediate military issue per se. One more thing that I was alluding to, that's why I mentioned Libya, is the fact that, and again, as an Italian, I'm especially, let's say, sensitive to this. What happened, I think, in terms of the transatlantic debate on Libya, and not just Libya, but more generally North Africa after 2011 and the years that followed, was that we forgot some of the responsibilities we mentioned at the time. I remember, for example, very well the transatlantic debates between the Obama administration and the European governments at the time. And it was pretty clear, to me at least, that the Europeans were taking on a responsibility collectively for the future of Libya. Again, for the future of Libya, not for the immediate, change of government. That was an operation that the Obama administration accepted to undertake on our request, essentially. Our meaning collectively the Europeans, with some caveats, with a number of issues and so on. So that's another area where I think NATO could be much more useful than it has been so far, however difficult it could be. And then finally, I think, again, it's a matter of doing many things at the same time. So the wide menu that I mentioned, not just in terms of capabilities, but in terms of attention span, I think Africa is another major issue that we'll have to confront whether we like it or not, because it's immediately connected with North Africa. There's no distinction between North Africa, the Sahel, and what happens in the rest of the continent at this point. So we'll have to also find ways in which NATO can be useful. And it doesn't have to be necessarily the military dimension again, but that will be a big component. Being serious and being taken seriously as in terms of deterrence, in terms of actionability of our commitments will be important, I think, in the African continent as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we now have 25 minutes for your questions, which I think is great. So thank you very much for being brief and to the point. And be as quick as Florence, who gets the first question.
Okay, it's actually not a question. I'm going to come out swinging at Karl-Heinz, who's my former boss, so he can take it. And this is a debate between two Germans, because I think that while I'm as excited as you about what's been going on in Germany since the invasion, I'm not nearly as optimistic as you, because this is not just about that 100 billion. We will probably need 2 decades to even get to the level where we want it to be. And that's a problem, because it's not like, it's very much turtle in the hair. By the time we get there, the Russians will have already evolved into something else. In fact, they're already changing in terms of manpower. You know, they want to increase in size, mechanize their units, etc., etc. So I think my fear is that by the time Germany gets there, the future has already changed. And the reason for that is that my feeling is that while the German public has responded very strongly to this, there still is no strategic culture. And I say this because my other half, my French half, of course, I'm quite familiar with how French military and strategic thinking is. It's not nearly comparable. There still is the German reflex to just pay your way out of a strategic problem. Please answer how can I sleep soundly with this in mind? Deter me from my question.
Well, thank you. I am optimistic simply because I saw in the last 1.5 years things which I had never believed to happen. We shouldn't forget that all the changes in Germany has been taking place by a red-green government, by 2 parties who don't have the military in their genes. So the change is even more decisive. We still have, what surprises me, a majority in Germany for keeping up the sanctions. We have, in June last year, we had a poll in Germany saying that 52% of the Germans are supporting the presence of US nuclear forces on German soil. 65% of these supporters were voters of the Greens. I'm a little bit longer in this business. I haven't seen this for ages. The point you have absolutely is the lacking strategic thinking, okay? Yes, we are not France, and we are not the UK, and we are not the US. Some might say for good reasons and for historical reasons. Still, one change, it's a tiny thing. We have produced, for the first time, a national security strategy. We can discuss on whether this is a good document. I was in the team for the German MOD. What surprised me is the lack of tough and hard debates we had, although we were talking about thorny issues like weapons export, something difficult for the German. Defense budget, very difficult for the Germans. So I see this alleged pacifist, always backwards-oriented country moving in a way which surprised me. Is this enough in 5 years? I don't know. But still, the step so far is much more than I have expected. Particularly, as I said, as it comes from, because always the question is the Zeitenwende lasting? And the Zeitenwende is lasting first because it has been made by a red-green government. It is support, we have a fundamentally changed climate in the parliament. We are discussing about supporting Ukraine quickly enough, this weapon, that weapon, but the overall consensus to support Ukraine is there from the very left to the very right. Even at the extremes, at the fringes, people are saying, well, it might not be so good such a good idea always to support Russia. So once again, it is more than I expected. Is it enough? I don't know.
As a Zeitenwende watcher, Zeitenwende Beobachter, whatever you want to call it, I can't resist jumping in this conversation. You know, I am indeed, I think we have there, when it comes to Germany, but that could apply to a number of European countries, we're very much into a sort of glass half full versus glass half empty type of situation. If we look at where Germany was 3-5 years ago on these issues, or 10 years ago, it's a tectonic change and super impressive. If we look at where it could be, should be, its ability to sustain it, the remaining push, and I think that's for me the biggest cause for worry, that there is still a real constituency that believes that there is some going back to normal. When I don't believe there is a going back to normal, there is hopefully a better world at some point, but it's not going back to the previous world. And I think that is the, shaping the conversation in these terms is very demanding, because there is a candid hope, maybe more in certain political constituencies than in the public itself, that there is this need to, there's this opportunity to go back to normal in terms, and the back to normal includes low defense spending, limited investment, no strategic thinking, and all of that, because things are back to normal, which won't happen, I'm afraid.
Okay, we're back to normal. So we have the gentleman over there in the second row. Please introduce yourself and mention who your question is to. Thank you.
My name is Vesel Mehmedi, Ambassador of North Macedonia here in Italy. Allow me first to thank the Foundation, the organizers for this, the panelists, of course, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In order to frame my question, well, the topic of today's conference is how to balance the priorities of NATO. If we listen to Ambassador Minuto Rizzo, he would say, well, the priorities should be somewhere between East and the South. If you listen to the Italians, they would say South. If you listen to Americans, they would say Far East. And if you listen to the Germans, we have so many problems there. So my question is what previously Ambassador Stefano Pontecorvo provoked us all, although it was quite fast. So do you believe that in order to find the balance or the attraction force of all these problems that were mentioned by the panelists, we can go in a perpendicular direction and talk about space, as Ambassador Stefano mentioned, that space might be a bridge for so many countries. So do you believe that space investment is an attraction force sufficient to get out of this mess that is going on with regard to balancing all the priorities for NATO in what, 2 or 5 or 10 years that we are talking, because whether we are talking about spending, whether we are talking about MENA, whether we are talking about Far East or the South or the East, do you believe, I'm talking about the panelists, that the space is a sufficient attraction force in order to balance the priorities for NATO and for other alliances? Thank you.
Maybe other colleagues will want to chip in, but just two things. I think Ambassador Pontecorvo rightly flagged space as a domain, it's a new domain of operation for NATO. And I think it sort of shows that the traditional debates, South versus East, operations versus territorial defense, is somewhat misleading. What I mean by that is not that we don't have to focus on, as I just did, on the conventional deterrence for the defense of Europe, but it means that, in a way, if you talk Russia, a large portion of it is going to be about MENA and the Middle East. It's not only about Ukraine. If you talk China, China is very active in outer space, in cyberspace. So it's not a matter of are the Chinese forces at our borders, but the fact that in those new domains of challenge, we find that. So I think the notion that all these debates are much more integrated than they used to be, and that we have to manage to think a little bit outside the traditional boxes, you know, saying, oh, the Italians talk about the South and the Poles talk about the East, and the French talk about nuclear, and the Germans talk about whatever, and the Americans talk about Asia, are true but misleading us into a conversation which is wrong. If we talk about the Western Balkans, the issue of Chinese-Russian influence in the region is of critical importance if we want to think through this. So what I'm saying here is that we really need to be able to think through these topics in much more integrated fashion than simply with the traditional boxes that are still often guiding or researchers, some of us are think tankers, or even the position of governments.
There you go. I have it. Yeah, in 10 seconds, I very much agree with this comment, because some of the categories we're using are a bit old. In fact, I would just add one point to the ambassador, that all of the differences, let's say the different types of emphasis, you know, and priorities you mentioned, and many of them are still there, so they're real. But the thing is, they're one of the strengths of the alliance. I think they're one of the reasons why Ambassador Minuto Rizzo reminded us NATO has been so durable. So let's not take it as a sign of weakness. I think it's the way for a democratic alliance to function. Of course, it's complicated. It's a nightmare for the diplomats, I'm sure. But what you've described is a point of strength, I think.
Okay, we'll go to the gentleman over there in the second row. There should be a microphone coming up to you. Thank you. Please introduce yourself and mention to whom your question is directed.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm Gonzalo Ceballos from the Spanish Atlantic Association. My question is to all the panel, but basically it's been hovering in the conversation. Mr. Camp and Mr. Minotti mentioned both the mobs on the Capitol Hill and the public opinion that guides our countries in NATO. And my question would be, one of the challenges that we're risking, and it's the political dimension of NATO, the reinforcement of democracies within NATO, the public support for all the things that we have to do in NATO. And my question would be, what is NATO doing other than discussing the capabilities that would be needed to reinforce, to strengthen the resilience of our public opinions, democracy, and some sort of barrier to disinformation?
There we go. Okay. Yeah, thank you for the great observation. It's an important point. I think it's more than a question of what NATO can do, though, honestly. I think it's a question of what all of us can do. And I think you have to look at it from an integrated perspective, which is, yes, that we have organizations and entities that are rooted, in fact, in democratic principles, and we often haven't done a good job of making the case for those principles. We've kind of let it slide. We thought with the end of the Cold War everything is fine. We're flipping to the human default position of democracy and free markets. And well, it turns out that's not really the way we've gone overall, worldwide, and we need to think about that better. I would recommend an important, very important article by Robert Gates, who was Secretary of Defense in the US for both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, interestingly. And he's making very much the sort of case you're making, sir. That we haven't done enough to defend democracy, we're not doing enough to make our case, and we have, this sort of political battle between, populism, sovereignism, and forces of democracy, political democracy, that are often, I think, a bit dispirited. I'm not sure I have the magic bullet, though.
Karl-Heinz.
Okay, same answer. I don't have a magic bullet either. And yes, democracy is challenged in all countries, not only in the US, also in our countries. So we have two contradicting trends. On the one hand, we have this West apparently functioning in the eyes of Putin or Xi Jinping. On the other hand, there is an internal erosion of the West. True. I think the only sort of hope or the only positive sign is that the populists in all countries do not offer solutions. They profit from the unease which is in the country, in the US, like saying, what about nation building at home? Then instead of nation building in some other countries, it's in Germany, it's in France, everywhere. But when they are asked, okay, fine, that's your problem, what is your solution? You don't have a single one. And after a while, the voters realize this, and then they fall back, part of them, they fall back to those parties, left, right, whatever, who at least offer solutions. Whether they work at the end, no one knows. This is a weak answer, I know, but I don't think that there is not that much you can really do, except the fact that, of course, institutions like the Atlantic Organization are extremely important, but it is an internal process of the public realizing that easy answers usually are no answers.
Okay, and I think, we have 5 more minutes, I'm told, and I know we have 2 questions, well, maybe 3, because I see a lady putting up her hand over there. So let's take those 3 questions together, and then we'll have the panelists respond. So we'll go to Miguel over there first. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Anna, and I'm a student of MENA region. I'm graduating in political science and international relationship, and I would like to ask a question to Karl-Heinz, but to the whole panel also. And you talk about a strong instability in the MENA, but as we know, we are witnessing a new era, and in particular about a multipolarity in the international scenario. In particular, reference about Iran and the Arab Gulf. So my question is, what's about the role of NATO in the Middle East after these historical events, about the BRICS and the other countries that are adhering to this particular BRICS? By the time that Arab Gulf countries are such an important partners for NATO, and do you think that this could be a threat for the transatlantic alliance, or an opportunity to cooperate? And how do you think we could deal?
That's more than one question.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you so much. We'll go over there.
Okay, now. Okay, thank you, Anna. I'm the Spanish ambassador to Italy, and I've been for between 2018 and 2022 ambassador to NATO. Thank you for your presentations, remarks. It had been a real thought-provoking, and thank you therefore. My question is addressed to any one of you or to you all. We have been flying a little bit over the NATO-China relationships. I want you now to go down and to land on it. And when I was sitting around the North Atlantic Council table, we used to ask ourselves if we were in front of, when speaking about Russia and China, if we were in front of a tactical relationship or a more strategic relationship, of course, in a political sense. And my question is if we today, or do you see there are some movements in Moscow and Beijing, some people thinking about upgrading this political strategic relationship to become a more formal military alliance in the future, in the middle term or something like that? Thank you.
My name is Carlo Trezza. I am a member of the scientific board of the NATO Foundation in Rome. My question is the following. I have the sense that the transatlantic relationship, US-Europe, is the key issue we are discussing here. And on the one hand, I heard Stefano Pontecorvo saying that there is incompatibility between the goals of the Atlantic Alliance and the European Union, because the alliance seeks more spending, whereas the European Union requests budget discipline. On the other hand, Eric Tersuolo said that the evolution of the transatlantic relationship is going in the right direction. So we have to discuss this issue. My sense is that we have to take into account that the European Union is changing. Its composition has changed in the past years. The UK has abandoned the European Union. 2 new countries, formerly neutralistic countries, have joined. So there's more homogeneity in the EU. Isn't this the time to enhance the support the idea of Europe speaking with one single voice in NATO, the so-called caucus, European caucus?
Okay, European caucus. So we have 3 minutes and 10 seconds for all this. And I know we also had a question on Zoom about how can we convince the public about the need for more effective defense spending. So panel, over to you in 3 minutes.
Who's going to start? Not sure whether I got completely the question on the Middle East. It was difficult to understand. Role of NATO in Iran, if I got it correctly. the transatlantic community, and I choose my words, has a role in the region because we are affected by crisis there. The question is, which is the best organization to deal with? And NATO has become very humble with regard to its efficiency in crisis management operations in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Iraq. So the role of NATO is limited because it has a certain toolbox which is not necessarily suited for the problems there. And this is what we learned, and so that's why I think it should be divided on a broader role on EU and others, and the famous single voice of the EU, sorry, it's not going to happen because we don't have a single voice in the EU. We have even less a single voice in the EU than in NATO.
Really quickly, NATO and the EU are different. They are intrinsically different. They can cooperate. Indeed, at the beginning of this year, if memory serves, they once again, the two organizations put together, a statement of principles for cooperation and aims, which I think was a positive thing. But push comes to shove on the defense side, there aren't going to ever be two sets of assets, of equivalent assets, So, and NATO is clearly, it's the organization that is providing security.
Let me pick some of these in sort of one sentence, which allows to be blunt. On NATO EU, I think we're not where we should be. I think we could do much better in terms of cooperation between the two organizations. The reasons for that are well known. There are reluctancies from some allies and some EU member states on deepening that cooperation. I think what the war in Ukraine has shown is that both organizations can and are working in the same direction. I think we could do better in terms of much better in terms of meeting and really sharing a lot of effort. And I think there is room for progress there. Convincing the public. Two figures. Since 2000, the defense spending in Europe has remained essentially flat, including the recent increase. It's plus 22% since 2000. During that same period, China is plus 566%, and Russia plus 227%. So we are in an environment which is not really safe, and spending a little more to be safe makes sense. Lastly, on Miguel's point on China, Russia, I think what the current war is showing the most for me is the reversal of the relationship between the two. Must be tough for Putin to be the junior partner in that relationship. And that is something that is, I think, one of the key figures, and we have to sort of think through this. It turns out that Brzezinski was right when he said that the future of Russia was either to be a partner of the West or a satellite of China.
Yeah, I will only pick the last question as well, the China-Russia. I think the relationship is extremely asymmetrical and becoming more so, to the answer of the ambassador, which doesn't mean that there will not be at some point maybe a more formal alliance, but it will be an alliance that the Russians will certainly, it would be frustrating for them, extremely frustrating for them. And on this very last point, I think neither China nor Russia, and that's again playing to our strength, have a model to offer to anybody else. I mean, Russia is not a political model anybody else in the world would ever like to emulate. They don't even win wars anymore, right? So China, we don't know, but I think it's a tough sell for them as well, right? Especially right now. Thanks.
And on that big geostrategic point, please give a big round of applause to our panel, Eric Terzolo, Karl-Heinz Frank, Camille Grand, and Roberto Menotti. And now I'll pass the microphone back to Ambassador Minuto Rizzo.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It was a very interesting discussion. It's a pity that we have a limited time because the issue is so large that we could discuss at length all this let's say, sensitive topics. So thank you very much. Now, before the coffee break, I have the special intervention by Mr. Giovanni Soccodato, who is the general manager of a very important company, MBDA, a multinational company, I think 4 countries, you may correct me, and I'm sure that it will be a very interesting presentation because Mr. Soccodato has a long experience in strategic thinking about multinational industries. Giovanni.
Thanks, Alessandro, and thanks to the NATO Defense Foundation for giving the opportunity to industry to give a perspective, maybe a simpler, lower-level perspective, but hopefully interesting view of thinking. Listening at this debate, we spoke about high-level policy, the importance of investments, capabilities, operational capabilities. I think one element which is key and important for me is to understand that across these 2 levels, there's another lower level, which is industry. In the end, part of these investments are going to industry and going to industry to deliver capabilities, which are important systems, solutions, weapons, to enable operational capabilities of our forces, to enable what the alliance and what our countries have to do. And NATO has recognized that. The Defense Production Action Plan has confirmed the need to have a robust, resilient, sustainable defense industrial base, which is able to deliver capabilities in the long term, deliver them today, and to prepare also for the future. But what we see today is that our system, our industrial system across Europe, in the overall the Western Alliance, is under stress. I mean, DDP-AP has also called to boost production. Boost production means step up the level of activity in a short term, ramp up. But ramp up short term, you need to be ready. So it means that you need to have investments. The investment we have discussed before needs to be planned well in advance to be able to have the possibility to make available the capabilities in the right timing to ramp up whenever needed. Need planning in proper timing. They ask for agile, joint procurement to kind of work together, coming together. But to do that, you need to have the common requirements. Common requirements aim to have interoperability, to have standards. NATO is doing that. We say EU is not acting together, fine, but if we are not able, at least in these elements, to act together, to come together and to express this sort of joint way of being, joint way of acting, I think it will be very difficult for industry to deliver quickly, promptly, that level of capability which are needed to deliver to our armed forces going forward into the future. And then we have to be able to innovate. We have to be able to keep the technology edge going forward, going into the future. And here as well, what the Alliance is doing and what Europe is doing is very important. I think Diana, which has been mentioned, somebody in the first, I think is a very important element because it paves the way, really, to foster an ecosystem which allows cooperation across industries, which allows access to emerging disruptive technologies in areas, in places where defense has never been looking for in the past. Startups, small and medium enterprises, besides the research centers and university. It starts to create and to foster that dialogue, that interaction, which is needed for us to go forward and look into the future. But I think that to do that and to do that in an effective way, in particular in Europe, cooperation is key. The fact that we are able to enable our industries to work together, to share, and to work in the same environment, I think is very important. And looking at our company, as Sandro mentioned before, I think MBDA, is a very good and perfect example in that respect. If some of my predecessors, more than 20 years ago, didn't take the bold move to decide to pull together their industrial capabilities in one strategic sector, which is missile defense in Europe, bringing together core industrial capabilities from France, Germany, UK, and Italy into a single company, I think today we will not be able in Europe to express industrial capability in design, development, manufacturing, and innovation across this very important core sector. We have seen today how important it is to express a full and complete air defense capability, a full and complete air-to-air capability. I think the fact that we have made that bold move of pulling together in the past is enabling Europe today to have a complete capability across the different domains, from ground-based air defense to air-to-air to surface, and this is very important. But looking forward, I think that it's very important that we keep in mind that I think that one of the big challenges we have is that NATO and EU needs to continue to foster this kind of environment of cooperation. I think we mentioned Diana and the actions of the DPAP from NATO, but also EDF, S.p.A, ASAP, EDIRPA, I think is very important on the EU side as well. I think the real challenge for us, we were thinking before of strategic thinking going forward. I think the real challenge today we have collectively, on one side, is to fulfill the short-term needs. So to boost production, to use what we have, to make sure that we can ramp up, we can deliver, we can step up. But then I think it's very important that we don't lose sight of the future. Because what we fear as industry, is that by fulfilling short-term needs and focusing on short-term needs, we lose sight of emerging technologies, we lose sight of new products, of innovation, which will allow us to keep that technology edge and the leadership edge in products and capabilities for the future. So the real invitation is really look at the short term, but think also what are the investments that we need to put together today to develop new technologies, to develop new products, which will enable us to have capabilities into the future. And this is a challenge, in my view, where we'll see whether Europe on one side, the alliance on the other side, will be able really to bring together our nations into a collective effort and to join really forces in delivering those capabilities for the future. And this has to go through the whole chain, from the policy and the political approach and the sharing the same views to the operational capabilities that armed forces would express and the requirements that we put together, and to enable industries, us, to work together and collectively deliver these capabilities to go into the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your very interesting and very brilliant intervention. I think that the moment has come for a good coffee break after so many thoughts, so many ideas. Half an hour, we'll be back at 5:30 to go into the quiet waters of NATO at Brussels and security to the south. See you later.
Yeah.